Amnesty International say that Navalny is no longer to be regarded as a prisoner of conscience. And I am not an expert on the internal workings of Amnesty International. So what we're going to focus on in this explainer video is, should this make you have second thoughts about Navalny in any way, as somebody looking upon this situation from the West without perfect knowledge of all the details? Is there something to him that one should be suspicious of? Did he get up to some bad stuff? And if so, how bad was it? Or is this just a product of Amnesty International just being caught up in Russian propaganda or in spectacularly politically counterproductive bureaucracy? Let's talk about this. Now, certainly, I'm going to just come out and say this. This is a blunder by Amnesty International. And it's a blunder because people, not just working for Navalny's cause in Russia, but people working against the government, are going to be disempowered to a degree of 0.0000001% by this statement from Amnesty International. Why is the effect so little? Well, the effect so little is that we tend to overestimate how much what we do in the West changes the situation in Russia. There are a couple of particular levers that are effective, and we'll be talking about this another time on this channel, but broadly speaking, very little that we do really makes much of a difference. But this is going to be a victory for Russian propaganda, and may be in part caused by Russian propaganda. So let's look at two things here that are interesting. What did Navalny get up to that could raise a question mark in anybody's mind, if anything? Number one. Number two, what are the weaknesses of Navalny as a compelling political candidate? I mean, are there any major weaknesses that would, get our alarm bells out? Well, let's start with this second bit. There are problems with Navalny, but they're irrelevant. I mean, they're irrelevant because we're 743 steps away from him being the president of democratic Russia. But quite certainly, Navalny has a disposition to populism. What does that mean? It means that he isn't completely irresponsible like Boris Johnson. So Boris Johnson is constitutionally irresponsible. And this would be true if Boris Johnson agreed with you on policy. So it's not about what he believes and what the actions of his government are. He is constitutionally irresponsible. In other words, he is able to really not feel the impact on other people of things that he does, and therefore he can do things to advantage himself that come at the expense of very important groups of people, and he is able in a constitutional way to just not really register that. And Navalny is certainly not like that. He feels a sense of responsibility, but he is some way to being a populist. And that means that if you look at the last decade and a half of his political activity, he spends a lot of time swimming with the current. So somebody who is of strong liberal conviction, some kind of really wet liberal who reads Turgenev, would say, yeah, I mean, Navalny is all over the place. I mean, there's some very basic things he is into, like democracy, but he is all over the place. And he is a guy who goes where it pays to be. He is less a leader who lays out certain convictions and then tries to carry the people that he wants to lead with him. He is a guy who wants to find out what might be a maximally advantageous direction within certain limits, but these limits are pretty broad, and then he wants to go full power ahead in that direction. And indeed, short of playing to the gallery, what's been clear is that Navalny has had limited ideological centeredness. His program has often been unclear and has often been a little bit disturbing to people on the right and to people on the left, depending what year we're in. So this is not a guy who is rigorously rooted in some kind of UK Conservative Party position on the ideological spectrum, or UK Liberal Democrat Party position on the ideological spectrum. The gap between the two for Navalny is relatively insignificant. I mean, he would just swing between the two easily and even further than that. So because he's that kind of politician, he has rightly put a lot of people off, and he's put a lot of people off in Russia who are Western looking in the sense that they would favor a particular kind of political movement, political momentum. They would say, I'm a sort of, social democrat of a Bernie Sanders kind, or I am a center-right soft Tory, And if you are these things, Navalny is tricky because he's just going to be all over the shop. Now, this might be changing. But he is not a guy who has the most profoundly thought through values that, as it were, permeate particular political proposals. But I mean, that's not really a very bad thing. So let's look at what he might have been up to, short of this kind of oscillation that in particular raises alarm bells. He has been associated with being part of a nationalist movement in Russia some years back. I mean, for me though, he doesn't really have any strong nationalist beliefs that worry me. He just doesn't. What we saw is this kind of oscillation from him, and he hasn't been doing any of that recently because it's not been politically expedient, and I think he's probably grown out of it too, but he could then in the future potentially do other things into which he could swing in and out. But basically, if you analyze his blog between about 2006 and maybe 2012, 2013, you will see remarks there which, if you are a Guardian reader, you would certainly not be comfortable with. Remarks about ethnic minorities in Russia and remarks about the countries to Russia's southern border and how we might think of folks from these countries if we're Russian and we're considering how to organize the immigration and the border between the two countries. You would certainly be uncomfortable. And a lot of the things he has said would not be sort of explicitly fascistic. They wouldn't even be explicitly xenophobic, but they would just be in bad taste and very transparently appeals to a particular constituency that he at that moment found advantageous. So on the balance of this, do we give Navalny a pass or do we fail him? And even if we fail him, he of course remains a prisoner of conscience, and Amnesty remains in blunder here. Is a pass, is a clear pass. And even if you do dig out a few unlovely moments and a few unlovely remarks, I mean, in the context of what he's trying to achieve in Russia and the forces he is battling against, and in the context of the fact that he is a decent guy, and he's not completely irresponsible as a politician, he does have a sense of political responsibility. So in that context, is a pass for Navalny. Anything else would be, fish too small to fry.